A newborn baby disappeared from her crib in the middle of the night. Her name was Lila, just 3 weeks old. The family home was tucked away in a peaceful cul-de-sac in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors brought over casseroles after births and funerals, and where nothing truly sinister had ever happened. But on the night of July 20, 2002, that illusion shattered. It began with silence. Julie and Mark Halberd had put their daughter to bed like they had every other night. Julie remembered how Lila had finally taken a full bottle without fussing, how she drifted off with a tiny sigh in her sleep, a half-smile curling on her lips. It had been a good day, a rare one for new parents. Mark checked the baby monitor, kissed his wife on the forehead, and they both fell asleep watching late-night television. When they woke up the next morning, everything changed. Julie was the first to notice. It was just past 6 a.m., the usual time for Lila's next feeding. She walked into the nursery, bleary-eyed, expecting the usual hungry whimpers. But the crib was empty, neatly made, the blankets undisturbed. At first, she thought maybe Mark had taken Lila downstairs. Maybe she'd cried and he'd handled it. But there was no sound, no baby, no monitor buzz, no distant hum of bottle warming. Then she saw the baby monitor, unplugged, resting on its side on the carpet. Julie screamed. Mark came running, but there was no misunderstanding. Lila was gone. The house was quiet, too quiet. They called 911. The Cedar Falls police arrived in under 10 minutes, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no open windows, no footprints in the flower bed beneath the nursery window. The baby gate was still latched at the stairs. The only oddity was the monitor unplugged and placed face down. The neighborhood locked down. Doors were knocked on. Driveways were searched. A silver alert was issued. By midday, the story had already made the Des Moines Evening News. Newborn missing from her crib. Cedar Falls police investigating possible abduction. Whispers began spreading. Was it a stranger, a break-in, or something closer to home? Behind the scenes, the parents came under scrutiny. Police separated them for interviews. Mark's alibi that he'd gone out to the garage to smoke a cigarette around 2 a.m. was cross-checked against the home security timestamps. Julie's phone logs were pulled. CPS was called in. Nothing pointed definitively to either of them, but the undertone was clear. Suspicion lingered. And then there was the town. At first, neighbors brought over meals and support. But by day 2, people were closing their blinds. Friends avoided eye contact in grocery stores. The Halberds became ghosts in their own neighborhood, their lives suspended in a blur of grief, fear, and unanswered questions. The FBI stepped in on day 2. Agents searched the property with dogs and thermal scanners. They combed the wooded areas beyond the backyard. They knocked on every door in a 5-block radius. Nothing. It was as if Lila had simply evaporated. But something was off. Julie knew it. She couldn't put it into words, but the house no longer felt like home. There were strange drafts she hadn't noticed before, a faint, musty smell in the hall. And then there was Murphy. Murphy was their golden retriever, 13 years old, slowing down, mostly blind in one eye, and too arthritic to jump onto the couch anymore. But on the third day, July 5th, Murphy changed. That morning, as the sun burned off the early fog, Mark noticed Murphy wasn't inside. The back door had been left open during the chaos of visitors and law enforcement. Mark stepped outside, calling for him. The dog didn't come. Eventually, he found Murphy pressed up against the far right corner of the backyard fence, the one closest to the neighbor's house. He wasn't barking, he was whining. Low, guttural, rhythmic sounds. His front paws scratched obsessively at the dirt below a cracked fence post. Mark called to him. Murphy ignored him. What was strange wasn't the dog's behavior, but his focus. This wasn't random anxiety. Murphy was obsessed with something beneath the soil, something he could smell. Mark grabbed a shovel. At first, it was just earth soft from recent rains, with roots clinging like veins. But 3 inches down, the blade hit something that wasn't soil, something smooth and synthetic. A plastic grocery bag. Mark pulled it out carefully. His hands were shaking. The plastic was knotted. Inside, he found something that made his stomach flip. Lila's pink knit cap. The one Julie had made by hand. The one she always wore to bed. It was stained. And beneath the cap, a scorched, half-melted disposable camera. Mark froze. He yelled for Julie. She came running. The two of them stood in the yard, in silence, as Murphy sat down beside the disturbed soil and let out a low, mournful groan. They didn't know it yet, but the camera, warped and blackened, held the key to everything. Police were called again. The FBI returned. The backyard became a crime scene. The cap was bagged and sent for DNA confirmation. The camera was rushed to a local lab for restoration. If any of the film inside had survived, they were told, it might take days to process. Julie barely slept that night. She couldn't stop seeing that cap, picturing it slipping off Lila's tiny head, wondering what kind of person could take a child and bury her clothing like a trophy. But even then, she didn't imagine the truth. Not the photos on the camera, not the woman next door, and not the hidden door just beneath their feet. The camera was old, a cheap Kodak disposable, the kind you'd grab at a gas station before a birthday party or camping trip. Most of it had melted, and the plastic casing was warped from heat. But the film inside had been miraculously preserved, partially shielded by the layers of plastic and soil. By the time the FBI's digital forensics team developed the roll, it had been nearly 36 hours since Mark dug it out of the dirt. Julie hadn't left the house in that time. She stayed curled on the living room floor, clutching Lila's stuffed giraffe and listening to the baby monitor, though she knew there was nothing on the other end but static. Then came the knock. The agent, a quiet man in a windbreaker named Moore, had a laptop. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down, opened the screen, and clicked through the scanned images. Julie and Mark leaned in, breath held. The first few frames were normal, casual. A backyard barbecue, a 4th of July banner, paper plates, a woman smiling behind a set of sunglasses, a dog, more smiles. They didn't recognize the people at first. Then came the shot that broke the rhythm and broke Julie's heart. It was a baby, wrapped in a yellow blanket, eyes closed, arms reaching. It was Lila. Julie gasped. Mark gripped her hand. But the timestamp on the photo said March 2001, over a year before Lila was born. More photos followed, some with the same baby, some with the same woman from earlier, the one in sunglasses. Always indoors, always dim lighting. It looked like the inside of a house, but with old wallpaper and worn furniture, not theirs. Julie shook her head, her voice barely audible. That doesn't make sense. That's Lila. That's our baby. Agent Moore stayed silent. Then he clicked to the last image. It showed a crib. Not Lila's. An older wooden one with peeling white paint. And in the corner of the frame, a woman's face reflected in a standing mirror. Half turned, partially shadowed. But Julie recognized her. Karen Whitmer. The neighbor. She lived alone in the house next door, the one on the other side of the fence where Murphy had started digging. Karen had always seemed kind, if a little distant. She never came to block parties, but she sometimes brought over brownies. She always waved. She'd even knit Lila a pair of booties when she was born. Julie remembered thanking her. She remembered Karen standing on their porch, staring too long at the baby, saying, "She's perfect. She's exactly right." 2 weeks before Lila vanished, Karen's house had caught fire. It had been ruled accidental, a faulty space heater in the basement. Karen hadn't made it out. She died alone. The fire hadn't spread beyond her property, but the charred remains of the house still stood dark, skeletal, a reminder of fragility. At the time, it had been a tragedy. Now, it felt like a warning. The police got a warrant the same day the photos were confirmed. The Halberds stood in their backyard and watched as agents pushed through the blackened side door of Karen's home with crowbars and gloves. They searched for hours. Then someone shouted, They'd found a basement door previously hidden behind what looked like a panel of insulation, and beyond that, a sealed room. Inside was a nightmare. The space was maybe 8 feet by 8. A crib, formula, diapers, stacks of baby clothes, a mobile still hanging from the ceiling. And next to the crib, a small tape recorder, its speaker charred, but the tape inside still partially intact. They played what they could salvage. The sound was eerie. A woman's voice low, lilting, singing lullabies over and over, in between songs, murmurs, talking to someone, to a baby. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I knew you'd come back to me." Karen had lost a child. That much became clear quickly. Her estranged sister came forward after the FBI contacted her, revealing that Karen had suffered a stillbirth in early 2001, a little girl, born 2 months premature. The family had tried to help. Karen refused grief counseling. She stopped returning calls. Over time, she pulled back entirely. Her sister hadn't seen her in over a year by the time the fire occurred. But the delusion hadn't faded. It had deepened. The photos were of her baby. The baby she lost. Karen had clung to those photos, and when Julie gave birth, something in Karen's mind snapped. She believed Lila was hers. Not metaphorically, not with longing. Literally. She was convinced Lila was her own daughter returned. A sign, a second chance. She planned the abduction for months. Investigators traced evidence of the obsession through journals recovered from a fireproof box in Karen's closet. Pages and pages of writing, some lucid, some unhinged. She detailed Lila's birth, though no one had told her. She drew maps of the Halberds' home, timetables, schedules. She even listed which formula brands they used. But the most disturbing entry came 2 weeks before the abduction. "The window is perfect. Crawl space opens into theirs. I've measured it. I just need the right night. She cries for me. I hear her." What Julie and Mark hadn't realized, what no one had, was that the houses shared a shallow crawl space beneath their foundations. A small, disused opening that had been bricked over decades earlier but still accessible from Karen's basement. It led directly beneath the Halberds' nursery. On the night of July 20, Karen had pried it open. She'd slipped into the crawl space, pulled aside the vent grate behind the nursery wall, and taken Lila while her parents slept upstairs. But she never made it back. Coroners confirmed Karen had suffered a grand mal seizure in the early morning hours of July 3rd. She collapsed beside her basement heater. The seizure likely triggered the fire, a slow burn that eventually spread through the wiring. And in the chaos, she'd left Lila behind. The baby, still wrapped in blankets, had been tucked near the fence corner. Karen had planned to retrieve her through the crawl space, but fate intervened. And Murphy, that old stubborn dog, had heard something beneath the soil that no one else could. Lila had been out there for hours, perhaps longer, but she was alive. Dehydrated, cold, hungry, but alive. Julie broke down when she heard. Her daughter had been only feet away, just beyond the wooden fence, for 3 days, hidden in silence. Her cries muffled by earth and wood and distance. And no one had heard except Murphy. The investigation closed with no further suspects. There was no prosecution, no trial. Karen was dead. But the Halberds were left with scars deeper than any criminal sentence could provide. Their baby was home, but the truth, the why, would haunt them forever. The morning Lila came home was overcast, a thick gray sky hanging low over the cul-de-sac, like the air itself was still holding its breath. There were no welcome home signs, no neighbors peering from porches. Just quiet. Julie held her daughter tighter than she ever had before. Lila was thinner, paler, but she blinked in the soft light with the same curious eyes. A paramedic warned that reuniting might feel overwhelming, that it might take time. But the moment Julie kissed her daughter's temple, Lila let out the tiniest sigh like she remembered. Mark stood beside them, a hand on the baby's back, the other still trembling. Murphy sat at their feet, head bowed, tail gently wagging. He didn't need a reward. He didn't need praise. He had simply done what he knew: watched, waited, protected. The press swarmed that day. Helicopters, vans, satellite dishes blooming like alien flowers across the block. But the Halberds didn't speak. Not then. Not for weeks. They were processing the impossible, not just that their daughter had been taken, but how easily it had happened. The police walked them through the timeline again, this time with new details. Karen had used the crawl space at least twice before the abduction. Surveillance from a neighbor's security system showed her crouching beside the side of her house at odd hours. She'd tested the soil, watched the light patterns from the nursery window. She'd unplugged the baby monitor the day before the abduction during a visit when she'd dropped off a gift, a knit rattle. Julie had let her in, thanked her, not realizing the power cord had been tugged loose beneath the dresser. There was no violent entry because Karen had never forced anything. She'd used silence, familiarity, the natural trust that neighbors are supposed to deserve. Julie kept revisiting the moment she handed Lila over to Karen once just briefly, at the mailbox. How Karen had cradled her with such eerie calm. How she'd stared too long. It had seemed odd then, but not threatening. Now, it made her sick. The community, once a tight cluster of block parties and borrowed sugar, changed overnight. Houses were sold. Fences grew taller. The Halberds' mailbox filled with sympathy cards from strangers and distance from friends. People didn't know what to say. Some never tried. But one person did. Her name was Evelyn, Karen's sister. She visited a month later, quietly, respectfully, without media. She came with a manila envelope of photos and letters. And guilt. She apologized for what Karen had done, for what she hadn't seen. "I thought she was healing," Evelyn said, sitting on the Halberds' back porch. "I didn't know how deep it had gone. I didn't know she still believed that the baby hadn't died." Karen had never named her stillborn daughter. She'd refused to sign the death certificate. In her journals, she referred to the baby only as her or mine. In some entries, she used the name Lila. "She thought your baby was hers," Evelyn said, not in a delusion of stealing, in a replacement, like she'd been sent back. Julie asked why Karen hadn't just asked for help. Evelyn answered softly, because in her mind, she wasn't broken. That haunted Julie more than anything else, that someone could spiral so far inward and no one noticed, that Karen had walked among them every day, quietly unraveling. Mark had his own questions. He asked about the camera. Why bury it? Evelyn hesitated, then said, "Karen thought if anything happened to her, someone would find it. She wanted someone to see her baby, her life, the one she thought she'd lost and found again." But it wasn't Karen's baby in those last photos. It was Lila. The FBI later theorized that Karen, as disturbed as she was, hadn't intended to hurt Lila. She had set up the room with care. Clean bottles, fresh formula, toys, blankets. The obsession was twisted, yes, but it had also been tragically maternal. Her intent wasn't torture, it was reclamation. In her own warped reality, she believed she was saving a life. But the danger was no less real. One seizure, one delay, and the baby was left in the cold dirt for 3 days, alive only by chance and an old dog's intuition. In the weeks that followed, Julie and Mark poured concrete over the crawl space. They sealed every vent, every grate, not out of fear but as a promise. No one would ever pass through those walls again. Murphy began to slow further. He'd always been elderly, but now he seemed heavier, as if carrying the weight of what he'd known before anyone else. On quiet evenings, Julie would sit on the back steps with Lila in her arms, watching Murphy as he lay near the fence. Sometimes, he would look toward that corner, the place where the dirt had shifted, and whine softly, almost like remembering. Time moved forward. The press faded. The neighbors were replaced by new families, new mailboxes, new stories. The burned house was bulldozed. A young couple bought the lot and built a 2-story gray home with white shutters. They never asked about the past. Lila grew up. She loved animals, especially dogs. She'd point to Murphy in old photos and ask if he'd saved her. Julie would nod. The story was too complex for childhood, but one day, she'd know. Mark returned to work. Julie started writing again. Life somehow resumed, not untouched, but stronger. There were birthdays. There were quiet mornings with cartoons and cereal, and there were long nights when Julie would stare at the baby monitor and still hear the static. Still wonder how close they had come to losing everything. But then she'd turn toward her daughter alive, breathing, dreaming, and the question would shift. How many times do we walk past the unthinkable? How often do we wave to it, offer it cookies, let it into our homes? Karen wasn't a monster. She was a woman crushed by grief, unmoored by tragedy, failed by those meant to catch her before she drifted too far. And in that gap, that silence, she created her own reality. A dangerous one. The final haunting truth wasn't how Lila had been taken, but how long she had gone unnoticed, how close she had been to never being found. If not for a dog. An old, nearly blind dog, who still knew when something was wrong, who refused to look away, and who, in the end, reminded everyone that even in silence someone might be listening. Lila never remembered the 3 days she was gone. She didn't have to. The memory didn't belong to her, it belonged to everyone else. To her mother, who had stared into a crib that was too still. To her father, who had clawed through dirt with his bare hands after the shovel slipped, and to Murphy, whose paw prints remained in that same corner of the yard long after the grass had grown back. As she got older, Lila asked questions. At first, they were simple. Why don't I have pictures from when I was a baby? Julie would pause, then say, because the camera was broken. When she was 10, Lila asked why her birthday felt so quiet, why her parents always looked sad that time of year, why they never went on vacation in July, why they left presents at the dog's grave. That was the year Julie told her the truth. Not everything. Not the photos, not the crawl space, but enough. There was a time, Julie said, when we didn't know if we'd ever see you again. Lila didn't speak. She just leaned into her mother's arms and cried.
Years passed. The world moved on. The story faded from local memory, replaced by new headlines, new tragedies. The lot where Karen's house once stood was now part of someone else's lawn. A swing set, a grill, a birthday banner once fluttered against the new fence where the soil had once given up its secrets. Julie didn't begrudge the new family. They were kind. They'd bought the place without knowing the history, and when they learned it, they didn't leave. They brought over muffins when Lila got accepted into high school, waved through the windows during snowstorms. They even got a dog, a collie named Jasper. But Julie never let Lila go into that backyard unsupervised, not until she was 13. There were no more secrets, not between them, but the silence still echoed. Sometimes Julie would sit alone and play back the tape, the last lullaby they salvaged from Karen's burned recorder. It wasn't for comfort, it was to remember, to remind herself how close they had come to a different ending. The woman's voice on the tape was haunting, yes, but it was also fragile. It was the sound of someone unraveling in slow motion. Karen hadn't meant to be evil. That's what the therapists kept saying, and Julie believed them. But intent didn't erase the impact. She had almost lost her child to someone else's unresolved grief. One night, when Lila was 15, she came downstairs and asked about the dog again. Not Murphy, the one from next door. Did Karen ever have a dog? Julie looked up from the dishes. No, she said. Why? Lila shrugged. I don't know. Sometimes when I'm in the backyard, I feel like someone's watching me from that corner. Not in a scary way, just like waiting. Julie dried her hands. She thought of Murphy, of how he'd spent the last few months of his life always lying near the fence. Never barking, just listening. I think you are remembering Murphy, she said gently. Lila nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Later that night, Julie opened the closet and pulled out the old manila folder Evelyn had left behind. She flipped through the journals again, the ones from Karen. Some pages were so water-damaged they were unreadable. Others were pristine. And in one, scrawled near the bottom in frantic ink, "She's here. I hear her breathing. I knew she'd come back to me." That line stuck, not for what it said, but for how certain it sounded. Delusion was a terrifying thing. She thought about how many people might be walking through the world, calm, smiling, waving from their porches, with that same certainty hiding just beneath the surface, believing something no one else could see, hearing voices no one else could hear, and how close that certainty had come to destroying everything. Years later, after Lila left for college, Mark found the disposable camera stored in their safety deposit box. It was still wrapped in evidence plastic, the label faded. He held it in his hand for a long time before placing it back. Some things, he'd decided, weren't meant to be thrown away, even if they could never be used again. The house grew quieter without Lila, but the back corner of the yard remained exactly the same. One fall evening, Mark noticed something odd. Jasper, the neighbor's collie, was sitting by the fence. Silent. Still. His gaze locked on that same spot Murphy had once obsessed over. He wasn't digging. He wasn't whining. He was simply there, guarding, as if waiting for something to come back, or making sure nothing did. Mark walked over and crouched beside him. The dog looked up, then back at the fence. He pressed his palm to the wood. And for a moment, he thought he heard something on the other side. Not sound, just presence. It passed quickly, but he didn't move for a long time. Back inside, Julie had tea waiting for him. She watched him come in and saw the look on his face. "She's safe," she said quietly. "I know," Mark replied, but they both knew the truth. Safety was not a permanent state. It was something you fought to protect. Every hour, every year, every generation. Not with fear, but with vigilance. And love. And dogs who refused to give up. In the end, the case never made it into national headlines. There was no Netflix series, no podcast expose, just a footnote in a police archive and a child who grew up. But in Cedar Falls, Iowa, people still talked, quietly, behind closed doors, about the summer of 2002. About the baby who vanished, about the fire, about the camera buried in the ground, and about the dog who wouldn't stop staring at the fence. Most people forgot the names, the dates, the details, but they remembered the silence and the fence and how close the darkness had come to slipping through.